All right. So the first speaker of the day is Duccio Calosi from the University of Barcelona about polysemy, conceptual expansion, and implementation. Duccio, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much, Delia, for inviting me. Today I will give you this talk about polysemy and conceptual expansion, and this is part of the last chapter of my PhD dissertation, which I plan to submit in around a month. So any feedback coming from you will be super valuable to close out this process, hopefully. And so today the idea of the talk is that I will use psycholinguistic work on polysemy to describe the process of what I call conceptual expansion. And the process of conceptual expansion, I spell it out in these terms. Like, it's the process where terms acquire new senses that are added to their semantic meaning. And these new senses typically originate from principled, non-literal uses of words. Okay, and then later on I'm going to explain how this relates to concepts as well. Because this is about terms, and then later I will explain how it relates to concepts. And then I'm going to argue in the latter part of the talk that the conceptual expansion view can answer specific versions of the change of subject objection to conceptual engineering and the implementation challenge, which is the topic of this workshop. So the structure of the talk, at the very beginning I'm going to talk about the relationship between conceptual engineering, semantic meaning, and speaker meaning. And speaker meaning is going to be a key notion for this talk, because I'm going to argue that it's non-literal uses of words, so the uses of divergent speaker meanings that can originate the new senses that get added to term semantic meanings. And then I'm going to discuss polysemy, some psycholinguistic work on polysemy and its sources. And then I'm going to use the work of these first two sections to describe the process of conceptual expansion, which I will then use to provide rejoinders to these challenges of change of subject and implementation. So let us get started with the first part. Right, so I want to start by briefly recapping the speaker meaning picture of conceptual engineering, which is due to Mark Pinder in a paper from 2021. So let me define first speaker meaning. So speaker meaning is this notion that comes from Vrije, and is supposed to capture what a speaker intends to convey with a given term in a given utterance in a given context. Okay? And this is to contrast with semantic meaning, which is what the word conveys in the language, regardless of the intentions of the speaker. And the important thing to notice is that speaker meaning and semantic meaning can diverge. So a speaker can decide to use a word in a way that is not aligned to how the word is usually used in the language and to what the word usually means in the language. Okay? So Pinder has argued that one can engage in conceptual engineering when one is making explicit what one will speaker mean by a given term in a given context. And here, of course, it's implicit, but it's about what one will divergently speaker mean, because if you use a speaker meaning which is in line with the semantic meaning of the word, which means that you use the word how it's usually used, then you're not engaging in conceptual engineering. That seems pretty obvious to me. But the idea from Pinder is that you can decide to use the words. Oops. I'm sorry, I just wanted to mute. So Pinder's idea is that you can engage in conceptual engineering when you select a divergent speaker meaning of a word and you make explicit that you will speaker mean that thing with that word in a given context, when you consistently use the word with that speaker meaning in that context, and when you present, Pinder only says implicitly, but I think that can be done also explicitly, and that shouldn't create any problem, the speaker meaning as good in such contexts. Okay, so this is the speaker meaning of the picture of conceptual engineering. You select a divergent speaker meaning, you make explicit that you use it, you consistently use it, and you present it as good. So let us look at a potential example of this. And I select as an example the famous case of the metalinguistic negotiation presented by Blanket and Sandel from 2013 as an example of metalinguistic negotiation. And this is an example that comes originally from Ludlow 2008. And Ludlow says that he overheard a radio debate between two radio hosts that are debating, I don't remember the details, something like the top 10 athletes of the first 10 years of the 2000s, something like this. and the first radio host utters the sentence, secretariat is an athlete, and secretariat, bear in mind, is a horse, okay, so it's not a human. And the second radio host utters the sentence, secretariat is not an athlete. And the idea is that we can describe this conversation as, according to Plunkett and Sandel, a metalinguistic negotiation, and arguably it's a metalinguistic negotiation where the first radio host, A, is using a divergent speaker meaning for athlete. So here I'm just going to assume that the semantic meaning of athlete usually only includes humans, it doesn't include non-human animals. Let us leave under this assumption, it doesn't matter so much. So under this assumption, we can say that A is using a divergent speaker meaning, because he's using the term athlete to refer to something that usually is not referred by this term, right? And of course he's implicitly presenting it as good in the given context and in the latter part of the radio debate. And if we bear in mind what was the definition of the speaker meaning picture of conceptual engineering, this should count as an instance of engaging in conceptual engineering, because there is one speaker who is using a word, namely athlete, in a divergent way, in a way that is not how it's usually used in the language. Right. Interestingly though, this very example has been challenged by Teresa Marquez in a paper from 2017, who objected that the secretariat case only involves figurative, non-literal speech. So basically she was saying that the first radio host is merely speaking metaphorically or metonymically, like he's speaking rhetorically, he's speaking non-literally, and so she was saying this is not a debate about which concept should be expressed by the term athlete. So she was putting in question whether this is really a metalinguistic negotiation. She was putting in question whether the concept of athlete is really at stake, right? And this objection by Marquez, I think, can be generalized as an objection to the speaker meaning picture of conceptual engineering, and it can be called here, I labeled it, the not literally objection. And the not literally objection goes like this. Occasional use of divergent speaker meaning is not sufficient to change a term's semantic meaning or to change the concept that the word is expressing, right? Just using one time or occasionally a word in a weird, different way doesn't imply a change in semantic meaning, right? This is the not literally objection. Or at least it doesn't change the words literally. Like it doesn't change how the word is used in the language, how the word is usually used in the language, of course, because this is just an occasional use. So this is the non-literally objection. But we observe, and here in the room we are mostly fans of conceptual engineering, so I think we all agree that semantic meanings do change, right? And here I selected just some examples that I find particularly clear and striking. Some of them are taken by this paper by Glasgow from 2020, and we can read them out. The term sick used to just mean ill, and now, like bad, also means good. Fantastic used to mean imaginary, and now also means wonderful. Bachelor used to mean young knight, then came to mean also rank of university achievement, and now also means unmarried man. Here I've been also with the question mark because I don't want to, also not being a native speaker, I don't want to commit to whether the previous senses have decayed completely or whether they are still there. And the last one seems to be the most clear. Meat used to mean food generally, and now only means, I would say, animal flesh. And I would say that it is intuitively implausible to say that these examples do not involve changes in semantic meaning. And in my PhD dissertation, I also give a meta-semantic story for why we should not think that that these examples don't involve a change in semantic meaning, but this meta-semantic story I will not tell you today because it would lead us too far. But we can also talk later in the Q&A about it. So at this point we are in a position to extrapolate a first dialectical conclusion that will let us proceed in this talk. And the first dialectical conclusion is this. The first observation was that occasional use of divergent speaker meaning does not suffice for changes in semantic meaning. Then the other observation is that words' semantic meaning do change because what words express in a language does change over time. And here is a point that I'm going to argue for more later, but I think we can already have an intuitive grasp of it. Such changes arguably start by people using words with divergent speaker meanings. Okay? Arguably start when people start using words in ways that in ways that they are not usually used in the language. Right? I think in these examples it's pretty clear. Like sick arguably had started being used by some people as meaning good, and then slowly this sense acquired more popularity, and then it became widespread, and then it became a well-established sense, and it got added to the term semantic. And so the dialectical conclusion is that we need to explain the path from divergent language use to changes of semantic meaning. So what I would like to do is to make a step forward within the speaker meaning picture of conceptual engineering, because I do believe that using divergent speaker meanings is an important method for conceptual engineering, but I would like to make a little step forward into explaining the path that goes from divergent language use to changes of semantic meaning. And in order to do that, I went into some psycholinguistic work on polysemy, which I will present. So, let us start with a couple of definitions. Let me see. Okay. So, definitions. A word is polysemous if associated with at least two different but related meanings or senses. Here, I will not take a position on whether it's better to frame it as one meaning, multiple senses, or different meanings. I don't think that there is much at stake for the purposes of my talk in this distinction, but let's keep in mind that a word is polysemous if it has at least two different but related meanings or senses, and some examples are the term school, that can refer to either the building school in a sentence like the school fell down and clearly referring to the building, and it can refer to the institution or to the people that work within it. If I utter a sentence like the school decided that tomorrow class will not take place, I'm not talking about the building, I'm talking about either the institution or the principal or the people that work within it. But I will spell out these examples in much more detail later on. So, and then a verb like cut that has either a physical dimension or a kind of abstract dimension. If I say she cut the rope in two, I'm giving this idea of slicing physically. If I say the bank cut its interest rates, I'm not saying that there is anything physical going on, but I'm speaking with this more abstract notion. And coffee that can refer, for example, to the plant, to the drink, to the beans, and to a variety of other things like the cup. Pass me the coffee, I'm talking about the cup. On the other hand, a word is homonymous if it's associated with at least two different and unrelated meanings. And some examples are bank. These are very famous examples. Bank that can refer to either the building, Actually, bank is an interesting case because one of the two senses, like the building, is polysemous because it can refer to also the institution, the people that work within it, but let's forget for the moment about this. So bank, like the building, institution thing, and bank, the river bank, right? These are two different and unrelated meanings. And bat, that can refer to either the animal or to the baseball bat, right? And these are two different and unrelated meanings. And here I put a quote by Collins and Vicente, who are two philosophers and psycholinguists that work on polysemy, and they say there is a sense in which every word is polysemous or has multiple meanings, insofar as word tokens can take on different construals relative to both their linguistic and extra-linguistic content. And this is something that we also kind of said yesterday, that polysemy is such a widespread phenomenon in language, is such an important phenomenon in language, and that many words in language are polysemous. And this quote was, I just put it here to highlight this fact, which we already also noticed yesterday. So, now I would like to distinguish two different kinds of polysemy and to talk about the sources of these two different kinds of polysemy. One kind of polysemy is what is called regular polysemy, and regular polysemy is defined in this way. A word is regularly polysemous if it has at least two different and related meanings or senses, and there is at least another word in the language, the senses of which are semantically distinguished in exactly the same way. Okay? So regular polysemy is where you have different senses and there are other words in the language that exhibit exactly the same pattern of division of senses. Let us see some of these classic patterns of regular polysemies. So one classic pattern is the physical object / content pattern, like with the term book. I can say the book is heavy and clearly referring to the physical object. I can say the book is interesting, most likely talking about its content. And this pattern is exhibited also by letter. The letter was white, or the letter was light, and the letter was emotionally moving. I'm talking in one case about the physical object, in one case about the content. CD, and there are plenty of other examples that exhibit this pattern. Another pattern is the institution, building, staff, individuals pattern that we already discussed with the case of school. And this pattern is exhibited also by a multitude of other terms like hospital, church, university, and many more, department, and you can really come up with many examples. One other pattern is the region, political institution, people pattern, like names of countries, for example, exhibit all this pattern. Like Brazil, it's a region, is a political institution, and like you can use it to refer to the region when you say Brazil is big, is huge. You can use it to talk about the political institution, where you say Brazil is developing, something like that. And you can talk about the people. You can even talk about football teams. You can really use the term in a multitude of ways. And this pattern is exhibited by all names of countries, for example, so it's exhibited by multiple words. Then there is the event food pattern, like lunch. Lunch is at 6, 6 a bit late also for Spain. Lunch is at 2, I'm talking about the event. Lunch was delicious, is about the food. I'm talking about the food. And then there is the content container pattern, and there are really so many patterns. These are some of the most salient that I decided to include here, just because I find them particularly easy to grasp. But the important idea is that regular polysemy is this kind of polysemy where there are other words in the language that exhibit the same patterns, right? And now comes the important bit, because typically patterns of regular polysemy are based on metonymical speech, on metonymy. Metonymy is a figure of speech that allows a word to refer to something closely associated with its original reference, right? So metonymy is this figure of speech that allows you to do this movement. Basically, you have the referent of a word, you find something that you find closely associated to it, and then you use the word that refers to the first referent in order to refer to the second referent. Okay? It's a figure of speech. It's non-literal speech. And the idea here that is a bit debatable, later we can discuss also maybe, that is that the two referents need not have intrinsic features or properties in common. This is not completely clear what it means, but I think the best way to picture this is to think about the school case, like the building and the institution, they don't have intrinsic features in common. Like in order to say what they have in common, you would have to say something like, they're both about teaching, something like that. One is the place where teaching takes place, one is the institution that operates the teaching, right? But they don't have any intrinsic properties in common. Like a building and a group of people don't have intrinsic properties in common. Of course, this is debatable, and it depends also on the views on properties. And but here, for now, I will not make a big deal out of it. So the key point that is discussed by psycholinguists, and especially by Vicente in a paper by 2024, is that senses of regularly polysemous words typically originate from metonymical speech becoming widespread. So some people start using the terms in metonymical ways to refer to things that are closely associated with the original reference. These senses become widespread, right? And then these senses become added to the term semantically. So the word can now refer literally, semantically, to the thing that is closely associated with its original reference, right? And Vicente also and other psycholinguists show that this actually happened in language in the cases of school, in the cases of hospital, and so on, and show that these patterns of regular polysemy really originated from non-literal metonymical uses of words becoming widespread, right? So this is an important conclusion. Because again, remember what was my goal? My goal was to explain the path from non-literal language use to new senses being added to terms. And here the psycholinguistic work of on polysemy is showing us that this is something that actually happens all the time in language. There are non-literal uses, namely metonymical uses, that when become widespread add new senses to terms semantic. So this is going to be something that I'm going to use to argue that non-literal language use can contribute to additions of senses to term semantic. Right. But let us go also to...
Can I ask for an example?
Yeah, of course.
Can you give an example?
An example is like all of these. All of these are examples that happened historically, right? And for me, one example of this happening, although some people might find it controversial, is the term water. So every liquid or every material thing, at some point when we discovered chemistry, like was closely associated with some chemical formula, all right, chemical composition. And at the beginning, like the original referent of water, in my view, was simply this colorless, transparent, and thirst-quenching liquid, right? Then chemists came up with this way of systematizing liquids and substances with chemical formulas, and then this was something closely associated with the original referent. You might want to argue that in this case there are some intrinsic properties in common. I don't want to go into that because that's completely complicated. And then after that we started using the same term, water, that used to refer only to the thirst-quenching thing, also to the chemical, to the molecule, right? And so this, I would say, is an example of that. Also a slightly maybe controversial example, but I think is useful to get an idea. Before, the term woman was only used to refer to a biological or a supposedly biological kind of adult human females. Then we realized that the term is that is closely associated to gender roles in society and stuff like that. And then we started using the term woman in order to refer to those gender roles and stuff, like what Haslanger is doing, for example, I would say something like that. And then, of course, in this room, I think we all agree that we are also arguing against the original sense of the word, and we are saying, okay, let's switch to this latter one and let's forget about the first one. The origin, I would say, is metonymical also in this case. You take something that is closely associated to the original referent, which was supposedly a biological kind, you realize that there is something closely associated which is a gender role in society, you use the same word to refer to the latter thing, and then the process of what I would call conceptual expansion would end there, but then as conceptual engineers we also might want to remove some senses from it. So this would be a kind of example.
Just a clarification, but I can also wait.
Let me see how much time we have.
Otherwise, I get lost because so isn't metonymy normally like you take something concrete for something abstract?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, a group of people, I wouldn't say it's something abstract, but actually, sorry, because the example of school started that first school was this kind of teaching action. Right, so it was something abstract, and then if the metonymy led it to refer to something concrete, the building where this teaching action takes place. So metonymy does not necessarily involve the movement from concrete to abstract. It can involve the movement from abstract to concrete, from concrete to concrete, and from abstract to abstract. Like metonymy as a figure of speech doesn't rule out any of this, at least how it's intended in this debate.
How do you go from, can you give an example from concrete to concrete?
Let me think about, well, arguably going from the liquid that you drink to the molecule, H2O is going from concrete to concrete, I would say. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry about this. I don't have an example on top of my mind, and I don't want to get stuck on that. So we can come back on this on the Q&A, and perhaps
I don't know, newspaper, the physical object newspaper, and the editors.
Okay. Yeah, that's also I would say.
Well, it's always going from the institution sense to from the concrete to the institution sense.
No, you could say the I don't know if it's concrete.
Okay, maybe that's something for the Q&A then.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And hopefully it will not make too much of a difference from my account that you have on this movement that you cannot have the concrete to concrete, but let's see, maybe it is a problem. Maybe it is a problem. Anyways, so the second kind of polysemy that I would like to deal with is this so-called irregular polysemy. And a word is irregularly polysemous if it has at least two different but related meanings or senses, and there is no other word in the language that exhibits the same exact pattern of patterns of senses being distinguished. Two examples I put here: the cut case. We can have something like, we have sentences like, she cut the rope with a knife, where I have this physical slicing sense. The bank cut its interest rates, which is like this reducing sense. And the river cuts the town in two, when it's this dividing sense, right? So it's all related senses, they are all related, now we will see how, but they are distinct. And then there is the run case. She ran a marathon today. I'm really referring to the physical movement of running. My brother runs a restaurant. I'm talking about managing. She's running for president. I'm using it to refer to something like campaigning. Right? And also here we have all related senses that are distinct. What is the interesting part about irregular polysemy? Is that typically irregular polysemies are based on metaphor. And metaphor is a different figure of speech from metonymy, although sometimes they can be confused. And metaphor is a figure of speech that allows a word to refer to something that resembles its original reference, right? And here usually how the psycholinguists that don't care too much about theories of properties in general say, there is one property about the original reference that you find in another thing, and then you use the words that refer to the original reference to refer to the other thing in virtue of this property being shared, right? So, for example, when Romeo says Juliet is the sun, basically what he's saying is that Juliet has one of the properties that the sun has, namely being luminous or beautiful or something like that. That's a clear example of metaphorical speech. And so the idea from the psycholinguistic literature is that in cases like cut and run, what happened is that at the beginning the bank cut its interest rates or the river cuts the town in two. They were merely metaphorical ways of speaking, right? And they were to be considered non-literal and occasional, and at some point these senses became popular and became widespread, and then they got added to the semantic meaning of the word, in the sense that now this is what these words mean in the language. Like every one of us is completely able and not puzzled when we have to uptake these words in this kind of sentences. Later on we're going to see also some details about this. So the idea from this section is that widespread metaphorical uses of words can generate new senses of irregularly polysemous words. Right. And here we are in the position to extrapolate the second conclusion, which is that principal non-literal speech, if widespread, can generate new senses for words. Using polysemous words according to these senses, if widespread, is not an instance of divergent speaker meaning anymore, because of the very definition of speaker meaning, which is this divergent occasional use of divergent speaker meaning. Sorry, the definition of divergent speaker meaning. And the new senses should be said to be added to the word semantic meaning, and this is compatible with most metasemantic accounts, including internalism, externalism, meta-internalism, and use theories of meaning. Something that I would like to flesh out is that polysemy is consistent with externalism, because polysemy can say that terms have some senses that are constructed with internalistic metasemantics and some senses that are constructed with externalistic metasemantics. So polysemy is not saying that externalism is false for all senses of words. Right? So they are compatible, but this we can talk about. So here now I'm in a position to describe to you the process of conceptual expansion. No, actually not quite yet, because first I would like to talk about the relationship between what I just said and concepts, because concepts were absent in this first part of the talk, and now they come and get a talk. So where concepts sneak in this talk and in this framework is due to the one representation hypothesis due to Vicente in a paper from 2024. So Vicente has argued, by backing up with evidence from work in psycholinguistics, that polysemous words are stored under one representation in the mind. he calls it lexical entry, lexical item. It can be called also mental file. Right? So this is the idea. Polysemous words are stored under one representation. Homonymous words, words with multiple and unrelated meanings, are stored in different representations, in different lexical entries in the brain. So they are stored in different places, if you may. And of course, it doesn't make sense to talk about places when we talk about the brain, but just to have a visual idea of what I'm talking about. So the psycholinguistic evidence in favor of the idea that polysemous words are stored in one representation are the following. Words with more related senses are recognized quicker than words with fewer related senses, which means that if you have a richer representation, like one representation of a word with multiple senses, the more senses it has, the more rich the representation is going to be, so the easier it's going to be for you to retrieve it. The second piece of evidence is that switching between senses of polysemes means polysemous words, is relatively costless, while switching between meanings of homonyms is cognitively effortful. The third piece of evidence is that senses of polysemes tend to co-activate, which is very connected to the second point, while meanings of or senses of homonyms tend to inhibit the activations of others. So when you activate one, the other one decays. In the case of homonyms, when you activate one, the other one also gets kind of co-activated in the case of polysemes. And here I just put this for if there are any fans of Zeugma tests. Like Vicente argues that purely linguistic tests like Zeugma tests, which are these tests of like combining and saying some sentences like the book is heavy and interesting, like trying to combine two predicates that refer to different senses of the words, would create Zeugma, which is this perplexity, something like that, right? Vicente is arguing that these are not fail-safe criteria to distinguish polysemy from other kinds of arguments. So this I just put it if someone is interested in some tests, while these other tests, these other psycholinguistic tests, seem to be very reliable into telling you, into distinguishing polysemy from homonymy and other kinds of things. So, what is very interesting is that the one representation hypothesis, so the idea that the polysemous words are stored into one lexical entry, is compatible with all following attributions of content to this lexical entry. So what is in this representation is the question. And Vicente argues that the one representation hypothesis is compatible with the following options. It can be that this representation stores something like a list of all the possible senses of the polyseme. Of course, it's not going to be a list of senses, it's going to be a list of information that gets selected in relevant context, something like this. And the second option is that it stores a core meaning, like an abstract summary that includes all, that potentially includes all senses. And this, if this would be a case, it would be something that I would say can support something like semantic minimalism for terms that are stored in that way. A pointer to a memory address or a core meaning plus all the possible senses, and let us not talk too much about this attitude. So the idea from Vicente, and this is very important, is that we should be pluralists about what is the content of these representations. He's arguing that in the case of regular polysemies, it's most likely, given the psycholinguistic evidence, that the representation is structured in the first way, like a structured list of all the possible senses, when there is the metonym, when there's regular polysemy based on metonym. Why? Because we have said that there is no one intrinsic thing that glues the senses together, but it's more like a network of associations. So it's more likely that they are stored in this listy kind of sense. And while in cases of irregular polysemy that are based on metaphor, Vicente argues we should consider representations as presenting a core meaning that encompasses all the senses, namely that thing that glues together all the possible senses of the word. And the fourth option is an option that Vicente argues is the most likely for cases of nested polysemy, which is a different kind of polysemy, which is like polysemy where from one sense of the word also you originate more polysemy, and is saying basically that this would be the way in which the representation is structured. But the important point is that polysemous words are stored under one representation, that the one representation can be seen as having different contents, and which contents this representation has should be decided in terms of the structure, in terms of the kind of polysemy that is exhibited by the term. So, How do concepts come into place? I would say at this point it's pretty clear. Sawyer has argued that, at least in the content of conceptual engineering, there are three main ways on the views on the nature of concepts: psychologistic, semantic, representationalists. Let's eliminate for the moment the latter two. Under the psychologistic view, concepts are the psychologically real cognitive structures in the mind of individual subjects. I think that at least one version of this view, one convincing version of this view, would tell you that concepts are exactly those representations that we are talking about. Those representations where you store terms and you store all the information about those terms and you store all the information about all the possible senses of those terms, right? I think there is at least one plausible view on the nature of concepts that identifies concepts with exactly this mental representation, and this is the notion of concepts that I will use in order to describe the process of conceptual expansion. But for me personally, there is nothing aesthetic. Like, I don't care about saying that this is the best notion of concept, that is the only notion of concept. This is not something I want to defend. I just want to use this notion to account for the process of conceptual expansion and just to give an idea about how the work of polysemy can be said to relate to concepts. So the conclusion is that polysemous words can be said to correspond to one concept: the mental representation, lexical entry, lexical item, mental file, where they're stored. Right. And at this point, we can describe and account for the process of conceptual expansion, because we have said that widespread principled non-literal speech can generate principled, I mean, following the figure of speech of metonym and metaphor in a sensible way. So principled non-literal speech that follows this figure of speech can generate new senses for words. These new senses are stored in the same lexical entry or in the same concept. So we can say that concepts can be expanded when principled non-literal uses of words become sufficiently widespread. What does it mean? That enough people in their mind are going to have this expanded mental entity where the new sense is stored there. Right? This is just what I mean when I say that concepts can be expanded. And adding new senses to word semantic meanings leads to conceptual expansion. This again, if enough people, if the sense is enough widespread, it means enough people have stored in their mind this new information about the term, and they are prone to use the term with this new sense. So I would say that conceptual expansion is a subset of conceptual engineering. It's in the sense that concepts do change because they have expanded without being necessarily revised or replaced. So in this process of conceptual expansion, I don't account for removing senses, I only account for adding senses. I consider it a subset of conceptual engineering in the sense that I think that there are some projects where the only thing we care about is to add senses in certain contexts, and we don't care about removing the previous senses. So for me, this is a view. But if we have projects where we will also want to remove previous senses, then this would be just a stage of conceptual. Conceptual expansion would be a stage of conceptual expansion. Right. So this is the view. This is the conceptual expansion. And I will take the last 10 minutes to give my rejoinders to the challenges. I have 10 minutes, right? We start with 5 minutes.
Yes, because then
we have
you would
5
have,
minutes.
yeah, exactly, like 30, 35 minutes. Yeah, we also started 5 minutes later.
Good. So, change of subject objection to conceptual engineering. This is a typical objection that has been moved towards conceptual engineering, and it's the idea that conceptual engineering might be arguing concepts too much. This is how Delia puts it in her forthcoming paper, and the issues at stake here are issues of conceptual identity and continuity or equality. And many authors agree that there are two main strategies to face this objection. One strategy is to provide a theory of subject continuity, so to say, oh no, I have a view about what you should think subjects are such that in cases of conceptual engineering, this thing doesn't change. And then there are normative answers, like the ones provided by Glasgow, Pinder, and I would say, in my view, also Delia's answer is a normative answer, because she's saying that the change of subject objection should be dismissed on dialectical grounds, like because it causes some dialectical problems for the debate, while Pinder and Glasgow are saying something like that sometimes we want to change the subject or sometimes it's good to change the subject. So today what I want to do is to use the framework of conceptual expansion to make a step forward in the first kind of structure, to provide a theory of subject continuity. And the idea is that the identity of the lexical entry, where the sense is stored, can be seen as the anchor of subject continuity. Okay? So polysemy studies show that if the added sense of the word is stored in the same lexical entry or concept, then the senses of the word are related enough. Right? This is exactly what the polysemy studies are saying. If it's stored in the same lexical entry, is polysemous, which means that they're related enough. If it's stored in two different lexical entries, it means that it's not related enough. And this, for example, is what I think is happening with the case of dinosaur. I already told Ethan yesterday. I think that that we have two very different senses, and that Ethan's perplexities about like switching between the senses, which I also share, like from the Jurassic Park sense and the bird sense of dinosaur, is very costly and very perplexing. I think one possible diagnosis is exactly this. Our brains are, the senses are so different that our brains are storing the term in two different lexical entries, and that explains perhaps why it's so hard, so costly to switch between them, why when we activate one, we kind of cannot really think about the other one. So let me skip the thing about externalism because I don't have time. So my point here, like the point of contribution that I would like to bring into the debate about this topic is that I think that conceptual engineers can use the psycholinguistic tests for polysemy to check whether projects of conceptual expansion, to check whether adding new senses to terms would cause a change of subject. Like if it would cause, because if the term gets stored, the new sense gets stored in a different representation, then we can say that there is really a change of subject. You are not talking about the same thing. At least that's what your brain is thinking, because it's storing it in a different place. Okay? You're not talking about the same thing. You are changing too much. And instead, if it's stored in the same representation, then you're still talking about the same thing, so you're not changing the subject. Right? There is a sense to argue that your brain is thinking that you're not changing the subject. Right? And I think that these tests would be very helpful to check that. While, for example, Zegma tests, as I said before, would not have this role, cannot maybe have this role. Right, so far so good about the change of subject objection, where I wanted to say just this thing, that there is one notion of subject that we can use, which is the subject as the representation in your mind, and then you can argue that when the sense is stored in the representation, then the subject stays the same, and this I would say is helpful for projects of conceptual engineering. And there are also tests to check whether your project would involve a change of subject in this sense. And about implementation, so the idea of the implementation challenge is that it's hard or perhaps impossible to get at least one version of the implementation challenge. To get real-world speakers to adopt and consistently use the new version of an engineered concept. And here there are several issues that are involved. One is semantic inertia, one is coordination problem, power and ideology, communication disruption, which you also mentioned yesterday, and pluralism of contexts. Right? And I want to say a little bit about the latter two, communication disruption and pluralism of context. Because, so the idea of the problem of communication disruption, one of the ideas, is that one of the worries is that using words with unexpected meanings can cause a cognitive effort on one's interlocutor. And this is totally shown by psycholinguistic literature on expectancy violation theory. I gave here a couple of references. And this has been used to argue that implementation of conceptual engineering projects might be either unfeasible because people will just not understand you, or bad because you will just cause bad communication and conversational practices. This has been used to argue for that. And my rejoinder is that, at least in the framework of conceptual expansion, where the new senses are originated through metonymy and metaphor, this problem is not that strong, because metonymy and metaphor are two very common figures of speech which do not require much cognitive effort in their processing. And here I also give you a couple of pieces of evidence. One is about metonymy, and this is research by Srinivasan and Schnelliker, that shows that even 4-year-old children already master metonymy to the point where they can apply metonymy, regular patterns of metonymy to new terms. And the other piece is that 3-year-old children already understand some metaphors, while 10-year-old children have full metaphorical understanding. Right? So if in our projects of conceptual expansion or conceptual engineering, we add new senses following principle non-literal speech that follows the figure of speech and metaphor, we can avoid the problem of causing communication disruption because the interlocutors will be able to accept you, perhaps in what Elizabeth yesterday called the ideal conversational context. Because if the interlocutor is against you and actively wants to resist your use, of course they are not going to uptake it, but they will be able to process it. That's the point. Right, and so and then the very last point is about conceptual pluralism and success, because I have been saying that projects of conceptual expansion are about adding new senses in some contexts, and this was connected to the speaker main picture of conceptual engineering, when Pinder was saying that we should just defend a divergent language use in some contexts, and you should defend that it's good in those contexts. And the idea for me is, and I just wanted to make a point about this, and so here I wanted to relate the discussion to what Guido called conceptual pluralism, that is the idea that terms express different concepts in different contexts. I rephrase in this context the idea of conceptual pluralism just to make it fit with my terms, but I think we are saying the same thing, is that terms have different senses in different contexts, although there is only one concept, at least if you have the view of concepts as these mental representations where you store this lexical entry stuff. And my idea is that in the framework of conceptual expansion, it is sufficient that some senses of a term are implemented in the relevant context for conceptual expansion to be successful. And you don't need to replace the old sense of the term in all contexts in order for conceptual expansion to be successful. This is an idea that you can be also found in the matrix from 2024. So this is something that I really care about because I like pluralist conceptual engineering and conceptual engineering in context. So I think that we should not overburden conceptual engineering with the task of changing a concept in all contexts and changing how people speak in all contexts. This might go for some projects, but I think is not what we want in all projects of conceptual engineering. And so I think we should reframe the notion of success so that even when we successfully implement a sense in one context, like in the case of conceptual expansion, we should count conceptual engineering as successful. And with this, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Duccio. Let's start with questions in the room and online. I'll do like this, and let's start with Guido.
So yeah, with the idea of like addressing the subject change objection, like with these, with the idea that there are these lexical entries, and then you store like the new sense under the same lexical entry, and that's like similar enough, and the subject is continuous. I mean, that's like interesting, good idea, I think, but it only addresses the subject change objection insofar as it has to do with this communicative disruption stuff, I think. And that doesn't seem to be, to me, like the main thing that people have in mind when they talk about the subject change worry. Like the original, like the Strawson worry was that, like when we have these ordinary language terms that cause paradoxes and perplexities, like truth, for example, then we can't like, and we're interested in those paradoxes and perplexities, like why they arise and whether we can like resolve them, then it doesn't address this problem if we like introduce this new sharp explicated meaning of like truth, for example. So yeah, like your thing doesn't seem to address this original subject change worry, right? So maybe it would just be good. I mean, maybe I missed it, but it would be good to make it explicit that it addresses like a specific kind of subject change worry that has to do with this communicative disruption.
Yeah, I was hoping, I wrote it there at the beginning, and then I went a bit too fast, and I forgot to say it. I completely agree with you. My point is about a specific version of the change of subject objection, and it doesn't answer the original Strawsonian challenge. And in the chapter...
yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, it's like specific versions, but then I forgot to say it again. And yeah, I usually like to I like to distinguish between two versions of the change of subject objection. Like I like to keep the Strasonian challenge with the label that Patrick Greenup, that was my supervisor in St. Andrews, gave it, which is like this old problem, which I like this label, which is like, yeah, even if you change, when you change the concept, you didn't solve the original philosophical problem. And I completely agree. I don't answer this.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Guido?
I thought it makes really sense. Like, so very clearly presented. I really liked it a lot. Sorry, I hate when people take time to formulate the question too much, but I feel like now I'm also with you, like talking about the topic problem. So yeah, I also worried the most about the subject change and topic change, because you say that's when you, so first, like when you have this kind of the nature of concepts, I think it's always very difficult to talk about the nature of concept, because first of all, like we don't see concepts. They're not anywhere, you know, like I don't know if they exist. I personally don't like to talk about concepts. Like when Sarah Sawyer talks about the nature of concept, I think it's misleading, because, well, she had, as you said, after just a second afterwards, you're like a different notion of concept. That's like a much nicer way to talk about it. It's like nature sounds like there's something real and we just capture the nature, whereas like it's really just tools, right? Like just kind of talk about concepts just like a model or something of the mind, and then you say nothing is at stake here. But I think everything hinges on that. But I don't want to make a destructive point, right?
Oh, no.
Like this totally makes sense. It's great, but just maybe something for the work building on your thesis, because everything hinges on that. Because so when you okay, this is gonna sound super destructive, but like it really isn't. Like I really think this is great. This publishing is awesome, right? But so basically, I feel like you're making, so by saying these concepts are in this, like, first of all, I don't know if you realize it, but like I think you're an invariantist. This is like a you know, kind of Idro-Macheri default invariantist idea of saying there's this one stable representation and it has this core, and then just kind of you add to it, and that's what you call conceptual expansion. And then the idea is, of course, the core stays the same. That's why there's no topic change, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay, and then you say something like, the reason we think it is kind of related is because they're part of the same structure. But the reason we think they're part of the same structure is, of course, because we think they're related. You know, like, so the big problem here is not with you, but the entire literature, I think, is you have this, like, a certain way to talk about the mind, or like representation, a certain way to talk about the mind and the brain that is kind of building what you want to, like something, like the original message is already built into that model, like talking about these stable structures, and then like all these sensors are kind of, then we do neuroscience on it, right? Like you talk a lot about, a bit like the kind of, as a scientist move, right? Like you use psycholinguistics to back up your model of the mind based on like all these kind of representations that are kind of like triggered, and like, you know, this kind of language. You use psycholinguistics that kind of, the whole psycholinguistics is based on that model of the mind as having these structures, these representational structures that are like retrieved and then triggered and like kind of at the same time related. But this is just a way to talk about behavior and intuitions. It's really hard for me to express it. Like when you say that they're related enough because they're stored in the same representation, you're just basically saying the same thing that you're just kind of making something an intuition, making it like scientific, you know, making it sound scientific, but actually you're just restating what you already said. You know, so the intuition is, well, if you think about school, I can say the school is on fire, and I say, And I have this intuition because I studied philosophy of language. So I have this intuition that the school is on fire is felicitous. So it is kind of like a good sentence, right? Because I did philosophy of language, there must be two senses there, because the school cannot be on fire because it's an institution, it's an abstract object. It has to be a building. So because I did philosophy of language, and I think the meaning is a referent, somehow I need to plug in an extra sense. I call that a sense. I'm just like trying to retell the story of how we got to this point of talking about metaphorically about the mind, but using structures, using all these like retrieval metaphors, related senses. Like, why do we talk about that? Because we have this intuition that, well, the sentence is fine. Somehow the sentence has to have truth conditions. Somehow we need to somehow it can't be true that the institution is on fire. We must assume that there must be a sense. We call that a sense, and then somehow it must be represented in the mind. So the sense must somehow be part of the structure. And then we do some psycholinguistics. Oh, we found actually people retrieve that faster, thinking about building of the school, and they don't retrieve the idea as quickly to think about the school as like something less familiar. And then we say, wow, that is evidence for there being such a structure. And now you're saying, well, the reason it's related is because it's related. Like the reason we have this idea, you know what I mean? Like I'm trying to express.
I understand what you're saying.
We start with like observations of intuitions and behavior, and of like well-formed sentences, and then we kind of like tell a story about structures and all these things, and we like convince ourselves that this is somehow science. So I'm really not against you.
Yeah. But I mean, the thing is that I'm not convinced. I don't care so much about this notion of concept and talking about the mental structure. Like the part that I care about a lot is the senses and the linguistic behavior and the semantic meaning part. Then, in order to relate it to the debate on conceptual engineering, in order for it to be more appealing for conceptual engineers and also for people that come from outside, maybe from scientific disciplines, and look into this debate and want to see something that they might find useful, I wanted to translate the key point, which was about senses and meanings in terms of concepts. And that's, I decided to be charitable and to adopt how they speak in psycholinguistics, or at least the psycholinguistics that I engaged with in order to talk about concepts in this sense. But yeah, I mean, I take very seriously.
So no, like my point is that the psycholinguists, they talk about that because we talked about that. Right, like the whole idea of psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics is based on like a certain kind of philosophy of language, and then we now like Gus Vicente, he goes and like takes that to make that kind of what he is talking about, these like default like invariantist but like still flexible enough structures to kind of like give authority to that idea. You know what I mean? So,
yeah.
Sorry, I'm being super long. I hate when people take so much time. I really apologize. But anyway, so the reason I'm talking about this is that to say this is somehow addressing problems, going back to what Eve said, I think, I don't know, I feel like I have some unease with that, because you say it's related enough because it's stored in that structure, but the reason we think it's stored in that structure is because we think it's related. And yeah, I don't know, I feel like we haven't really made progress.
I would say that related enough is not about storing the same structure, it's about the behaviors. The related enough, the point about related enough is about the fact that you co-activate the senses, that it's easy for you to switch between the senses, and that the retrieval is very easy. That's the important part about the senses being related enough. And then,
but you already bring in so much. So again, I really apologize. Like, and again, like, let me really say that this is not about your project, which is great, right? But I'm just saying, like, to just already talk about senses is already bringing in so much theoretical baggage, because we're not talking about behavior when we talk about senses. Senses are introduced as a theoretical invention to make sense of that behavior. You know, like so I don't know, like when I hear, like I'm just not convinced that this is actually true. Like and that's actually the paper you cited tries to tell this like different story
Which
about
one,
like
sorry?
the 2024.
The dissent.
No, the one that like
the
Christian wrote about like
Löhr.
critical
Yeah.
processing. It's actually trying to say, well, if the brain is always just kind of trying to make sense of its like sensory motor input, like trying to always kind of like predict what's going to happen next, you don't need to talk about all of, you know, like basically the language you use, which again is fair, is like super computationalist, it's super like, you know, like kind of like putting senses together to get truth conditions. That's really what this is about in the end. Like this is where this comes from. Like when you, I mean, that's just like a different way of thinking about it. Like it's kind of like making predictions, thinking in terms of good enough. Sorry, I'm just making a sentence this morning. And I mean, okay, let's talk about this later. I'm going to stop now because it's way too much.
Yeah,
I really
we need
apologize. Sorry.
to move forward with the questions. Danny, you didn't have one? Then
Yeah. I did an example of concrete to concrete autonomy. It's not the best one because it only works in British English.
Okay.
But if the word pudding in British English, which started off as like food that was cooked in a stomach, like back in the day, which is why you have black pudding and blood pudding. Then it metonymized to, I'll have to double check that this is the right order, but then it metonymized to like any sort of squished together food, which is how you end up with rice pudding and bread pudding. And then it metonymized to desserts, which is how you end up with sticky toffee pudding, which is like a cake dessert. So you get this movement from food cooked in a stomach to food that resembles food cooked in a stomach to sweet food that resembles the food that resembles the food that's cooked in
Wouldn't
a
that be
stomach.
metaphor though?
What, do you not think so?
Like a metaphor, I would say.
Metaphor,
It's
yeah.
a metaphor.
Metonym, yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's metaphor but not metaphor.
Really? Oh, okay. Well, I thought I had a
because
couple examples.
like I just follow this idea that these are two distinct figures of speech, and the metonym is this. Like I agree that there is not such a sharp. I think there is not such a sharp bound.
Yeah.
But if we want to keep them distinct in the way they do, then metonym is distinct. Like it's an association, but when it's an association where there is no one clear property that glues the two things together. While in the case that you presented, I think that you take the property of being squished together and you say, okay, and also this other thing is squished together, so I do it. So I use the term to refer to this other thing.
All right, I'm gonna,
These terms maybe would be a metaphor.
I'll have to keep thinking. I'm going to be thinking about this all day now. But my actual question, which was short, is more a comment. I feel bad that I'm also bringing up the change of topic objection, which is just like, I don't know if you're going to make any allies with this argument. Like, I'm on board with it, but like the change of topic objection is a first wave conceptual engineering problem. It's like people trying to like, you know, you've got people who are like, oh, so meaning can change, but like before that, or concepts can change, and before that, meaning and concepts were kind of their like bit of metaphysical groundwork, and then they lose that. So like, oh, maybe topics are what I can point to, and so you can't really tell that story. You can't really like fill that need in their hearts for certainty. Not to say it's bad. It's just you're not going to win the Hermans and Patrick of the
Yeah, that's
world.
not my goal.
Yeah. Good. That's all I wanted to say. So.
But I think it would like please Marshally and other people.
Yeah, but these are people who aren't really taking the objection seriously in the first place.
Yeah. No, you're right.
But Captain actually just mentioned this communicative disruption stuff also when he discusses subject change, like in the book, right? I mean, I think you could look up the place in the book where Kaplan talks about communication.
Yeah, maybe you can say that this is what he actually means, because nobody knows what he means, right? Like,
Doesn't know. He doesn't know.
Yeah, so maybe you can say this is actually makes sense, yeah.
Sorry, I'm online.
I just have a couple of comments. I really like this. I'm not invested in any of that change subject stuff, so just for me it's like excellent strategy and tactic for non-ideal implementation. I just kind of basically have some questions. Do they talk at all about synecdoche? The synecdoche key play a role?
Incidentally, these other figure of speech.
Uh-huh.
No, not in
Some of,
the...
some of your examples, I was wondering, like,
Can you briefly tell me what it is?
synecdoche is like when you use a part to refer to the whole. So like boots on the ground is a famous one, or like the engine, you refer to the car as the engine, or the wheels, something like that. So I didn't know if that was concrete to concrete, or if that's synecdoche or something else. So I was just kind of wondering if that comes up at all in your work. But the other thing I was, again, it's really just a comment, is it seems in non-conceptual engineering cases, given the points you made about it being less effort and the cost associated with this, would you say that principle of atomical uses is really just like sloppy language use that gets picked up? Like it seems like expansion is kind of like, yeah, I used school originally for this way, and then I just started being like, school's that and that and that, and then everybody else like starts picking up on it. Does that make sense? Like in non-conceptual engineering cases, it seems like, it's just sloppy language use that gets picked up.
Yeah, I would say in some of the examples I provided at the beginning where I was like sick to mean that comes to mean good, I would say that like it's cases where like it's just very non-literal, sometimes not language that then gets picked up. But I think that the same strategy can be used
absolutely.
to do serious projects.
Yeah, so it's interesting to be like, we're already doing it, now we can intervene in those.
Exactly, that would be the idea. And the synecdoche thing, I have to check whether, because I remember something about the part hole pattern. I don't know whether the authors that I referred to are systematizing it in one of the patterns of regular polysemy, like within the metonymical speech. I have to check.
Okay, cool.
But it could be, and that seems definitely to be a pattern of regular polysemy. And indeed, what they want to say is that typically, most of the time, these patterns are originated through metonymy, but they are not ruling out that they are also based on other figures of speech. And this could be a good case of that. And
That's one last, really short one.
I'll put you at the end of the queue because we still have Herman and also Simon on the chat.
sorry, I'm just going to read it out loud, or should we go to Herman's?
Yeah, go ahead with the chat and then we'll go back to Herman.
So the comment says, suppose a speaker uses the term atypically in choosing to include this as conceptual engineering or not. Do you think it is relevant whether the speaker's implicit or explicit preference is for that atypical use to become more widespread? Well, I would say in the speaker's mind, like if the speaker cares about making that non-literal use widespread, then the speaker can count himself or herself to be doing conceptual engineering. This, yes. But I think, so if the question is about relevance, I don't think it's so relevant. Like the speaker meaning picture of conceptual engineering, like the idea was just to identify one pattern of linguistic behavior and saying, oh look, this also can count as conceptual engineering. I think it depends on your preference. Sorry, let me read this second. Totally agree. Without dressing it up in problematic mental file language, I agree, and I think this is again kind of on the same line of, or maybe of what Guido is saying, like that. And indeed, what I care about is what happens on the linguistic level in terms of linguistic behaviors and stuff like this. Then my decision of dressing it up in these problematic terms is just to be able to talk with people that like these terms. Like I want to engage with them. Like I just have this attitude that I also personally don't like, for example, talking about the nature of concepts or talking about this kind of stuff. My only thing is about talking with them, but then I take very seriously the point by Guido that perhaps this way of talking are problematic, and so I shouldn't maybe buy into them just for the purpose of relating to them.
Can I just have very quick translation, because, so here's maybe one sentence fit put this. Like the reason we, the reason we think it's like kind of there are two senses of school is of course because we know the school has a building. That is the only reason. We know that schools have buildings, and that's why when you like talk about schools being on fire, you quickly understand what that means, because you know schools usually have buildings.
Yeah.
That is like such a simple way to make sense of that, without talking about senses and like being triggered and like that is so that's exactly the kind of like I don't know why these people are so attracted by it. Like maybe that's like I don't know why people are so attracted by this computational phrasing of this very simple phenomenon. Plus, this is all background knowledge, right? So this is all pragmatics. Because before you were talking about minimalism, this is not minimalism. This is all anti-minimalism. That is like all context dependent. Even that is like pragmatism. Like we can talk about this.
Yeah, let's talk about it later. About
yeah.
Point. And okay, maybe.
Yeah, let's go.
Thank you, great. So I had a really small question about the motivation for the paper as you presented it. So we started with the secretariat example, and this could be construed as conceptual engineering. Maybe then you say, well, just one occasional use of such a term in a non-standard way, that's not actual conceptual engineering. So I wonder why we say that. Why couldn't we just say, well, this is a very small step, and every time someone uses it differently, they take a really small step towards implementing a different concept. And of course, because it's just one single use, it's a really small step, and it probably doesn't do a lot, but it does something, and many of these small steps end up actually doing the work. So isn't that more also framing? I don't know whether it actually matters for your talk. When you said this, you said, well, I'm not really happy with this kind of implementation, so I'm going to other ways. I'm not sure.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for this question, and I do hope that in my chapter I'm already being more clear about this, and then maybe in the presentation I couldn't spell it out that clearly. But yeah, my idea is that like I disagree. Teresa Marquez, who is the one who objected, this is my supervisor, and I disagree with her. Like I think that in the case of the secretariat case is a legitimate example of fundamental implementation, so is a legitimate example of engaging in conceptual engineering. But the objection that she always gives to me is that, yeah, maybe you are engaging, like you're making this small step, but what you're doing is not sufficient to get conceptual change, because what you would have to do is to make this new sense widespread. So it's not enough to have this occasional use in order to have a semantic change or a conceptual change. Of course, if this occasional use becomes so widespread that it's not occasional anymore, that's what I'm saying. It leads to the changes that then I decided, perhaps infelicitously, to frame as conceptual expansion. But
isn't that then a very unfair objection from her? Because it's just like saying, well, you're running a marathon, and then when you're moving one step, then you're not actually running because you're not there yet, but it's an essential step that you have to take in order to reach the...
I think this was an objection she was putting. I think now she's convinced. Okay. I think now she likes what I have to say about it. And that she agrees with it.
Yeah, I was going to say you could like bolster, you could go back and bolster the meta-linguistic negotiation people and say like, why would we be like a pragmatist? Why would we be spending time writing about this, theorizing about it, philosophizing about it, if it was just some trivial thing anybody could do? Like, we're treating it as substantial, so you're giving an account of that substantial.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. I will make sure that the chapter will make it safe.
I will allow myself a question since I've been listening to all these exchanges and reconnecting to the point that Guido and also Simon were making. I think I totally agree that there's like a whole superstructure of concepts that you can choose to describe things with. your point seems to be, but maybe we can just focus on linguistic behavior. And maybe that's the key, the anchor then to this idea of subject matter, same subject matter. I wanted to make a comment about this because even though you forget about senses or meanings or core or whatever, even if you really don't want to talk about semantics and just focus, or semantic theory, whatever, and just focus on the idea of subject matter of topic, that's such an indeterminate notion that even though suppose you decide on a metric for measuring whether a certain response time corresponds to sameness of lexical entry and therefore sameness of subject matter, that's going to be completely arbitrary, right? So if it's like 1 millisecond more, how do you decide whether 1 millisecond more corresponds to same lexical entry as opposed to not the same lexical entry and therefore same topic or same subject matter? There's nothing, let's say, guiding you unless you have some sort of pre-constructed idea. So it seems to me that, yeah, there's like huge open-endedness on the notion itself of subject matter, and relying on linguistic behavior seems to be like a strategy that wasn't explored so far. So that's great, actually. That's I think I agree. We should publish it as soon as possible, and that's a great idea. But then it will run into limitations that are very similar to what Guido or what Ethan were mentioning. And they have to do with the fact that nobody knows what subject matter is.
Yeah.
And you can build it in different ways.
Thank you, yes. Yeah, this idea about the metrics and the psycholinguistic tests to check whether the conceptual engineer can talk changing the assumption or not. I completely agree there are going to be plenty of borderline cases. But the only point that I wanted to make is that, like, in the research on psycholinguistics and the polysemy homonymy distinction, like they are really different. Like your reaction times, like you can really see it. So of course there are going to be some terms
that's
that
super interesting.
So it's that's what I have to talk about.
And that's where you have to hammer with the empirical data, because maybe there is. I mean, we're all speculating and we're all throwing challenges at you, but you can actually rely on sort of empirical material and build a case.
One one. So when I hear conceptual expansion, this is just unrelated to all the previous ones. I think of concept creep and the broadening, the notion of broadening. Like there's this idea that concepts over time, sometimes for political reasons, their extension widens because the intention goes more narrow. So you kind of use some conditions of applications so you can broaden the scope of the concept. So basically, so concept expansion would be that I was thinking of how there's this idea of concept creep in psychology. It's from psychology that you start talking about more marginal cases of abuse and then calling them abuse, or more marginal cases of bullying and then calling them bullying, and then the right-wing people in psychology say that is because our young people are cuddled up and they're all super snowflakey and stuff. So that's what they call conceptual broadening or expansion or concept creep. I was wondering how you would make sense of that phenomenon of broadening the scope of application.
I think that's kind of what's happening. I would say that perhaps away from it sounds bad because it sounds that I'm saying that originally applying bullying to cases where bullying was not applied to generally, initially it's metaphorical speech. But that's the idea. You use the language in a non-literal way, you present it as good. You're saying we should use the term bullying in order to refer to something that usually refers to. Why? Because there is this one property, for example, the suffering caused on the victim and something like that, which is the relevant one of the referent that the word bullying refers usually to. And so we should apply the term also to this other phenomenon. And that's, I would say that's an example exactly of what I have in mind with this framework. Like you take the word, you look at the referent, you find something else in the word that has a property that you really want to connect with the other one, perhaps because the word has some political significance, some moral significance, and then you decide to argue for an expansion of the extension of the term so that it includes also this other phenomenon.
Your project is very much more like similar to Elizabeth, I think, than the whole like maybe we focus too much on the whole like psychological story. Right? Like, that is actually what you most care about. Right?
Yeah,
like,
in this kind of cases,
yeah.
definitely yes. Like the thing is that I would like also to apply this kind of framework also in some cases to scientific discourse and stuff like that. And in those cases, maybe it wouldn't be so much a matter of what also this was talking about. But in this case, it's definitely yes. Like it's the, and basically where the affective component and the feeling component is going to come in is in your arguments about why it is good to use the term in that non-neutral way. It's because not using it in that way has bad consequences also on an affective. That is one of the arguments for why you present the non-neutral language use as good, I would say. Thank you so much.
Okay, time to wrap up now. Thank you. Thank you, Guido.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to the people online. Thanks, Simon.